Hi everyone, welcome to today's reflective practice. I am just getting myself sorted, so bear with me 1 second. Cool, okay. Brilliant. So, welcome everybody to the second reflective practice live stream. Really excited to be doing this tonight. I'm Anjali, the Disillusioned Medic. I am a career coach for doctors, and I'm your host for this evening. So thank you so much for coming, for joining me. Hi Hannah, hi Sophia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. As always, this is a live stream, so share whatever you're comfortable with and anything that's not confidential. And please do comment in the chat as thoughts come to mind, but just be mindful that this is a public platform, obviously. So with that said, let's dive in. Today's reflective practice is going to be around the theme of imposter syndrome, something that we doctors are all too familiar with, and actually a lot of non-doctors are very familiar with too. For me personally, I feel like imposter syndrome has been a repeating motif throughout my life. But you know, as a doctor, I never really noticed it as a thing because it was almost like that feeling of being an imposter, of being a fraud is just, it's almost like an occupational hazard, right? I mean, pretty much all of us have that frequent feeling of feeling like we have no idea of what we're doing, especially as a junior doctor. So I don't think I realized how deeply ingrained that feeling was until I left medicine and entered the business world. So I just want to tell you a story around that. I remember one particular day, I'd just started working as a marketing consultant, and I had won my very first client, and I was doing a presentation for them around the basics of marketing and communications. And I do not hold a formal qualification in marketing at all. I'm completely self-taught. I've learned very much by experience. So standing in front of this room full of top executives in suits who were all men, and expecting me to advise them, it was profoundly intimidating, to say the least. And I tried to be confident, but inside I just felt like I have no fucking right to be here. That is honestly how I felt like. And as I continued working with them over the following months, I was just convinced that one day they were going to turn around and say, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And then their head of sales even turned around to me and said, "You've changed the way," like I had changed the way that he viewed marketing, the way that he viewed business, the way that he worked. He said that to me, and that felt amazing. And him saying that to me made it feel like, okay, maybe it's okay for me to be here. But what's interesting to me is that it took that someone else giving me that external validation for me to even begin to appreciate my skills and my experience. And now with this pandemic, with doctors being redeployed into, you know, completely new roles, new specialties that, you know, they've never worked in before, having to deal with things that they've never dealt with before, having to manage a constantly evolving and really difficult situation. I feel like this feeling of being an imposter is really important right now. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this theme of imposter syndrome. And if you guys have any experiences of this feeling yourself, please do share them in the chat. Would love to hear about your own experiences. And I'm delighted to say that tonight I have an expert on the subject to explore this with me. Sally Beyer is a coach, a career consultant as well from Liverpool. She's had an incredibly varied career, including working with grads and universities to help people find their calling. But she also amazingly has this special interest in imposter syndrome, and she's doing some incredible work around it, and specifically around imposter syndrome in doctors. So I feel so honoured to have her here with me tonight. And I'm going to add her in. Sally, welcome.
Hi Anjali.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Sally, obviously, imposter syndrome isn't a formal diagnosis, right? You wouldn't find it in the DSM classification or anything like that. So perhaps you could start us off with a definition. What exactly is imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think a good definition is that it's a collection of feelings, beliefs, or attitudes around not being good enough, which can undermine our confidence in certain situations. And I think that's an important one, because sometimes we can be feeling comfortable and confident, and yet it's other circumstances where we might feel on the edge or feel uncomfortable or doubt our place, should we say. So yeah, and it's a common experience as well. Imposter syndrome thrives when we feel like we're alone or when we're isolated, and yet research tells us that about 70% of people will experience it at some point in their lives.
Mm-hmm. I think what really struck me when we first talked about it was you mentioned some of the coping mechanisms that people use to deal with imposter syndrome. And I think that was the moment where I really recognized in myself, oh my gosh, I do this. So it was almost like a list almost of symptoms of feeling. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about those coping mechanisms and how they play out.
Yeah, I think there's some common threads with what people might do to cope with some of what you could call the symptoms. So over preparing and hard work, so thinking that they've got to put in lots of time and effort to meet the expectations of whatever it is that they're working on. Sometimes it's holding back and not sticking our head above the parapet for fear of exposing ourselves and opening ourselves up. So some of us might maintain a very low profile, so we don't stand out. For other people, some of those symptoms might be that we avoid extra responsibilities because we're scared that by doing extra things, it'll take time away from us being able to put lots of time and effort into the thing that we want to work on. And for others, it's going overboard on goal setting and tasks, or attributing success to outside factors. So I was successful because somebody helped me and they knew me and they were able to put a word in for me, rather than it was me and my skill and my competence. Yeah, other people, it could be self-sabotage, which is it's a deeply subconscious thing, but where we might say stay up late the night before an important meeting so that we can blame our poor performance on something else. But again, that's a very deeply unconscious thing that we do. But I think some of the classics are around procrastination, so dragging things out. And so, for example, one of my friends is doing her master's thesis at the moment in psychotherapy, and she said, I'm really struggling to even sort of finish things off, because as soon as I hand it in, then there's a chance that it can be failed, or I can get negative feedback. So we drag things out or never finish things because we're constantly perfecting.
That's really interesting, because I guess when I first think about imposter syndrome, I more think about the feeling in that moment of feeling like you don't really deserve to be there. But from what you're saying, it feels like there are elements of that kind of perfectionist kind of personality type almost, this kind of making sure that everything's absolutely spot on before you even submit something. So is there some crossover there between imposter syndrome and perfectionism?
Oh, definitely. I think perfectionism and imposter syndrome go hand in hand. And there's the research that's been done by Dr. Valerie Young back in 2011 in her book, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. She talked about some common imposter types where we rank and rate our competence. And one of those types is called the perfectionist, and that is the most common theme for people with imposter syndrome. So we believe that there's a right or a wrong way to do things. And it's all about how something is done, that we've got to do it perfectly, or if it's not good enough. So yeah, and personality plays a part in that as well. But some of these are beliefs that we develop through our lives.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to understand more about why you got interested in imposter syndrome in doctors specifically. And what is it about sort of medicine that drives it? Why is it so common amongst medical professionals?
Yeah, to be honest, I've had more experience of working with academic doctors because I work with postgrad researchers, and I initially got interested in imposter syndrome when I was working with them because I was seeing so many talented, intelligent, capable people who were clearly able and were passing exams and doing an amazing job, but in their minds they felt like they either didn't deserve a place or they felt like they couldn't do what they wanted to do from a career perspective. And that's what really drew my interest to it. And then since then, in some of the workshops that I've delivered at the Uni of Liverpool, I have had a number of clinicians come into the sessions, and we've had lots of conversations about what it's like for them working within a medical setting, and some of the situations that have emerged for them around their perceptions of confidence. And like you said at the start, there's lots of circumstances where you feel like, oh, this is new to me, I feel uncomfortable. Some of my friends are doctors and clinicians, and they've talked a lot about that feeling of feeling like a fraud and not knowing, feeling like when they compare themselves to their colleagues that they don't know enough, they're not as intelligent or not as capable and not as able. So sometimes it's about the work environment that we're in and what that breeds, and sometimes it's about a lot of the time it's about ourself and our beliefs about competence and our beliefs about our own ability and our skill levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this kind of idea of competence. I mean, we've just got a comment come through from Hannah, and she says, whenever I feel imposter syndrome, I feel that it comes from a place of fear of harming others or fear of other consequences. And that's really interesting to me because I recognize that so much from my memories of being a doctor. That sense of that there is so much potential for harm here. I could do so much damage if I make the wrong decision, and that's terrifying. And feeling like that sort of frequently, especially as a junior doctor, I think you internalize that, right? You internalize that narrative, and when you constantly feel like I could do something disastrously wrong, it becomes, if you tell yourself enough times, then it kind of becomes a core belief in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. And the interesting thing about imposter syndrome is it's a self-authored thing. It's what we say to ourselves. So yeah, and it also is very much linked to fear. Our imposter voice is often the voice of our fears. So that's a really, I understand Hannah's perspective completely, because when you're in that role, you have a position of responsibility, and you can sometimes feel like you're pushed beyond, or you're right at the very edge of your comfort zone when you're looking after people, or you're afraid of the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about how imposter syndrome might emerge? I mean, what sort of risk factors for imposter syndrome are there?
Yeah, interestingly, the research over the years has shown that there's some common risk factors where the door to imposter syndrome can be opened. So, for example, people who are the first in their families to go to university, or the first to do something that pushes them out of what's expected within their family or their community. So it might be related to socioeconomic class, where you have a shift. So I was the first person to go to university in my family, for example. And I can really remember that I feel like a fish out of water experience. And it could also be for people that are in a minority, so where we feel a stranger in a strange land, that sense that we don't belong. So it's quite common for international students and international employees, when they're working in a different culture or different language, to have that. But then there are also factors like if you're atypical in your field, so male midwives or female engineers working in a very male-dominated environment, that's quite a common time for the door to open. Sometimes it's related to our parents. So individuals who might have very high achieving or outstanding parents, although it might never be aired, there is that question of, well, am I here because of my parents and what they've done and their connections, or is it related to my capacity and my competence? Or it might be that we feel like we need to live up to the high expectations of others. So if we've been brought up in an environment or in a school situation where the goalposts are constantly being pushed out, so when we've achieved one thing, then there's another pressure put on us. And for some, it's about achieving success very early or unusually easily. So one of my friends who's a consultant pediatrician, she talked to me about a time when she was a teenager and she was thinking about medicine, and nobody in her family was medical, but one of their family friends was. And this family friend kept saying about how hard and how difficult the exams were going to be and how hard she'd have to work. And when she sat the exams, she found that they were okay. But that question of doubt was then put in her mind of, well, am I going to be able to do that again in the future?
Almost that sense of thinking too early.
Yeah, exactly. And so that thing of if you've been very, very good at stuff at a young age, that then is that question of, well, am I going to be able to carry it on? There's a couple of other areas as well. So people that work in creative industries, or particularly with the researchers that I work with, where their work is carried out over a long period of time and they're judged at the end of something. So it's when they produce the results of whatever it is, that can be really anxiety producing because you've not been given feedback, you've been quite isolated through that time. And the other key aspect is if you're working in a highly critical environment or in an organization that eats their own, or where you feel that there's competition, or it might be slightly adversarial, then that can really ramp up some of those feelings. Because even if you work in a supportive environment, our imposter can be there. So when the stakes are higher, then that can make it feel more anxiety producing.
No, absolutely. I mean, so much of what you just said resonates on so many levels for me. I mean, the criticism that you just met, that critical environment, that was the NHS all over for me. I mean, yes, there were people there who were supportive as well, but I think the culture in medicine sometimes felt like it was very macho, like you had to behave a certain way and be a certain way, and if you stepped out of your place, you'd be pounced on really, really quickly. You know, we all know that trope, right, of the consultant quizzing his students or his juniors, and you know, asking them impossibly difficult questions and putting them on the spot during a ward round, and you have to give the correct answer or you're shamed for the rest of the day. That critical environment really rings true for me. And I remember one experience, it was a teaching session, actually. It's pediatrics teaching, sorry, it was geriatrics teaching session, and I was working as a pediatric F2 at the time, so you know, very, very, very junior indeed. And the conversation was around, it was something that was specifically related to the elderly, maybe falls risks assessment or something like that, something that I can't remember exactly, but he asked us when was the last time that we filled one of those in, and I jokingly said something like, "Oh, we don't do that. We're the pediatricians." And I was expecting him to go, "Oh, ha ha, yeah. So you probably wouldn't have done that for a while." But instead, he jumped down my throat completely and said, "Oh, you think you're a pediatrician, do you? You're an F2, you know." And it was very much, "Shut up, sit down, stay in your place, little girl." And it was just, it was horrible because I couldn't, it was a teaching session, so I couldn't really say, oh, it was a joke. But it very much felt like that was the attitude, that was the environment. And so I can completely see how for doctors, it would constantly feed that sense of not being enough.
Definitely. And particularly in situations where it's related to achievement or approval related tasks, which is when you're in those environments that feel like a bit of a hotbed. That's really where it can affect you, because our beliefs about ourselves are fused in, particularly when there are high emotions. So when you've got shame there of somebody saying something that makes you feel bad about yourself, that can then create a really bad experience that you remember.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm really interested as well in you saying that the things like being the first in the family is an issue, and it's a risk factor, and being an ethnic minority. I mean, those two things are true for me personally. And there's something about this idea of unfamiliarity. Something about, if you cannot see your place, if it's not sort of been carved out for you and shown to you by, you know, your parents or the people around you over a long period of time, if the environment that you're in seems unfamiliar to you, that kind of keeps this idea of not belonging, and that feeds this imposter idea as well.
Yeah, definitely. And there, along with the other risk factors, there are researchers suggest that it is quite helpful to just shine a light back on some of your family experiences as well, because there are times from our early messages and early expectations that can feed that feeling as well. So some of the mixed messages that people might have had, or victims of family labels. So some people might have felt like they weren't the academic one, or they weren't the clever one, or they were the clever one. And yeah, so
these ideas can be fused in our minds from a very early age.
Yeah. And because our brains are designed to think, that we often don't go back and look at these thoughts about ourselves and our competence, because we think the way that we think. So that's why it's useful to just stop sometimes and slow down and think, what are some of these thoughts that I have about myself and my competence and my abilities, and are they still accurate? Because sometimes as we've grown and as we've developed, we have changed, but yeah, we can be held back by some of those thoughts. And often when we think about our inner critic, or some of that negative voice stuff that we all hear, don't we? Sometimes it's good to check whose is that negative voice, and is it something that I've had from when I was a lot younger that isn't relevant anymore?
No, it's interesting, because having that space and having, you know, the incentive to step back and think about that, you know, think about where is this voice coming from, and who is this voice. That's not something that we're called to do, particularly in medicine. You know, we don't have that imperative, that directive. It's very much all around, you know, your academic success at first, and then about your clinical knowledge and building that up. So for me, that's why this idea of reflective practice is so important, because those things seem very fluffy, but actually they can massively hold us back. I mean, Hannah's saying in the comments here, critical environments in medicine help build feelings around imposter syndrome. I think the real concern is the anxiety it can make you develop afterwards. And I really resonate with that. You know, that anxiety that builds when you're working as a doctor, it can be crippling. And so it's interesting to think about how not engaging with that conversation of not reflecting in that way can lead to these really debilitating outcomes.
Yeah, and Sophia's put a point there as well about specialties judge you on your performance, whether you pass specialty exams first time. Yeah.
Which then compounds that perception you have of yourself being unworthy and not belonging to that group. I mean, it's really sad. I mean, she said something, Sophia said something before as well. In such critical environments, as Anjali mentioned, often you are made to believe that your value, and by extension your identity, is tied to whatever performance you had on that day. I mean, that's such a hard position to be in, right, Sally? Because we all have bad days. We are all human, and we make mistakes. And I think one of the problems in the medical profession is that there isn't that room to be human, particularly now with this narrative around NHS heroes. I mean, I massively and deeply admire the people who are working on the front line, but I completely understand why they push back against this idea of being a hero, because it then makes it sound like you are superhuman, you know, that somehow you are infallible. And that is a massive amount of pressure. That is a huge thing to live up to. And then when you invariably make a mistake, because we all do, it feels like a massive fall from grace. It feels like a failure in so many ways. And I know that imposter syndrome is slightly different from failure, in the sense that it's not actually the failure that's critical, the critical piece here. But I do see a deep connection between the two ideas.
Yeah, and what's interesting from the research, Anjali, around imposter syndrome is how much of a role your seniors can have in helping people cope and recognize it and come to terms with it. So I'm interested from people's experiences within clinical settings of how their seniors have talked about these types of things, because we know the best way to move forward through these feelings is to talk about it and to hear other people's stories of how times when they felt like an imposter. But I'm just wondering how often that gets talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it does get talked about in medicine. I think it actually gets pushed under the carpet, and we continue to feed these behaviors. We continue to feed that environment, to almost kind of, I don't know, because it's tradition, because it's just the way that things are done, and it seems silly when we're talking about it now, but yeah, if that's the way that things always have been, I think it is extremely difficult for people to change those behaviors.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could move on a little bit to talk about, I mean, Hannah kind of brought this up in her comment when she talked about how that imposter feeling led to anxiety, but can we talk a little bit about how imposter syndrome affects us? And maybe, Sally, you could even tell us a little bit about how it's affected you personally.
Yeah. Well, have you got those slides that we were going to share, Anjali?
Oh, yes, I do indeed. So Sally's got a couple of slides. So let me just share those.
Yeah, imposter syndrome. Part of the reason why I'm so interested in it is because I recognise it's a big part of who I am at times in my life, and my imposter syndrome has affected me in various ways. In the past, I used to think it helped me to push me forward, but now I realise that actually having imposter syndrome is not helpful, and it's not good in the longer term because of the levels of stress that it can create in you. So I know it's there. I'm aware of it now, and through the work that I've done over the last few years, I've been able to spot when my imposter is there, and now use different tools and techniques to manage it, because I recognise the importance of being able to reflect on my successes in the past to help me cope with things in the future. Yeah, how about you? What's your imposter voice been in the past?
I'm just about to, sorry, Sally, I'm just sharing the screen. So perhaps we can, can we see the slides here now? Can you see that?
Yeah.
So perhaps you could talk us through these cycles, because actually they were really, really useful. It's like a written explanation of the feelings that we have.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I saw this, it's a brilliant book that I would recommend to everybody if you have struggled or are struggling with imposter syndrome, or if you have friends who you know have it, then this is a really helpful book by Dr. Jessamy Hibbard. But whenever we are in a stressful situation or something where we feel or sense our imposter coming, it's good to know that it's a thought trap. It's not a diagnosable illness. We can change it. And this is where the imposter thought cycle, when we know it exists, we can start to see it. So when people are stuck in imposter syndrome, it's because they misinterpret the discomfort and the anxiety. So they think, because I am feeling like an imposter, it must be that I am an imposter. Mm-hmm. So we all have that. I don't know what I'm doing, discomfort, anxiety. But because we take the feeling and we assume, well, that feeling is telling me that I must not be capable or competent, that we are an imposter, that then ramps up our fight, flight, and freeze response. So that sympathetic, the approach to stress goes higher and affects our ability to think straight and to problem solve. So we end up getting stuck in self-doubt, pulling ourselves down, fear of failure, which then again pushes our negative self-talk up. So we'll talk badly to ourselves and probably quite unkindly, and that pushes into the drive for perfection. So because we are capable and we're competent, we do get the job done, we do have the success, but through either avoiding certain things and then overworking at the last minute. But the interesting thing about this imposter thought cycle is that when we have the success, which we will because we're capable, even if we have bad days, we get good stuff done, but we feel relief rather than joy. So that means that we don't take on board the success that we've had and think, okay, well, what was it that I did in that situation that I did well? And we don't let our successes soak into our bones. And that's one of the issues with imposter syndrome, is that people don't own their success and remember it in the bad times to fall back on, or for when we're about to face a new challenge. So we just end up in this self-fulfilling cycle of doing something, not reflecting on it, and then going straight into the next challenge of whatever that is.
I mean, this rings so true for me. I do this all the time. Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago, I realized that I never really feel proud of myself, because, you know, if I do something right, then, oh yeah, whatever, it's just something I did. But if I do something wrong, then it's a completely different story. I'm the worst. I'm not capable. I'm just, completely incompetent. Like, this whole negative narrative starts, and
absolutely, and we've got
that way around.
Yeah, we've got something called confirmation bias that we know exists, where we will seek out the beliefs that confirm our thoughts about ourselves. So often we will look more at the negatives and weight the negatives rather than the positives. So and there is a common theme, isn't there, often with many of us, of feeling bad about talking about our successes or being proud of what we've been good at. So it's important to reflect on our strengths and our successes. So if you show the next slide, Angelique, because I think this, I'm really hoping that people that see this live stream will take this on board and use it as a step-by-step process, really. So the difference between somebody who struggles with imposter and somebody who's confident, it's only a slight difference, but it's important to recognise the fact that confident people still feel the discomfort and feel a level of anxiety. So they know that they are uncomfortable, but they sense and realise that anxiety is normal, and it's a normal part of doing something that's challenging or new. And they see they experience that anxiety and some of the anxiety helps them to up their performance. Mm-hmm. And by looking at the anxiety slightly differently and recognizing that it's not them, it's not that they're an imposter, it's that the situation that they're in is challenging, that helps them to keep their mind in a place where they can focus on more strategic stuff of, okay, well, what can I be asking myself? What questions can I be reflecting on around, okay, well, what can I do next? And if they do recognize any thinking errors in themselves, they can test those out. Okay, well, am I really that bad at that? I'm not. So I can, and they can ask other people. So it may be that they go out and find out more information about what's expected of them, but there is a more positive approach to that level of anxiety to push them forward. And they have a sense of their ability and trust in their ability that they'll be able to pull it off. And then that also means that their talk to themselves is more helpful and more constructive, which then leads them to success. But they also learn from that difficulty that they've gone through. So they think through, what did I do well? What would I do differently? But they allow their successes to come on board, and they think about, okay, well, what am I proud of? What did I do differently? Which gives a sense of self-satisfaction and increased self-esteem. So it helps to feed in. You've got something to fall back on the next time you face the new challenge. So one of the points that's recommended often by people when they are looking into pushing forward or overcoming imposter syndrome is that we write down all our successes, big and small. So what those achievements have been that we've had in the past, so that we can look back on them and remind ourselves of the times where we have felt discomfort, anxiety, out of our depth, at the edge of our comfort zone, but we can see that we did get through it and we learned. So
that's so interesting, this idea of writing down successes. As you said that, I had this kind of deeply quite uncomfortable feeling actually about that, because there's something boastful. I feel like it's bigging myself up, to kind of sit and write down. It feels kind of narcissistic to write down what my successes are, and yet I feel like it's something that I need to do, because what I very much felt about the first slide was that there is this sense of loneliness, and just keeping all those feelings to yourself, and they're all internalized, and you just keep going round and round in this negative narrative. But even something so simple as writing something down, it is an act of externalization in some way, of bringing in a different input from just this negative narrative, and also that asking others comes into that too, and it's about putting that new perspective on that feeling, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just reading what Hannah's put there. Really useful to see the internal process written down. You don't recognize the parts of the process until it's highlighted. Yeah, that's why I wanted to share this, Hannah, because this has been really helpful to me in grappling my own imposter experiences, and to be conscious of those times where I can feel my fight, flight and freeze kicking in, to stop that, so that I can think straight, and I can challenge some of those cognitive biases that might be happening in myself. And I was wondering from your perspective as people who've worked within clinical environments, how many opportunities you get to talk about your successes when you've done something well in a work environment. Because I know this is about reflective practice. Do you think it's part of the appraisal process, or do you talk about it with your colleagues, that when you see somebody do something really well, is that success celebrated at all?
That's a difficult one. Not really. No. There are awards that you can win, and obviously you can get colleagues to appraise you, and you have to go through an appraisal process. So you do get that feedback. But I think in medicine, for me, none of that stuff really stuck. Because it is such a demanding environment, because it is so fast paced. From the very first days of being a doctor, you are expected to just jump in. You're thrown in the deep end, and even with support, it can be very challenging. You're suddenly faced with things that are really, really difficult to do, and medicine is always changing, and as a trainee, you're always changing rotations. You're always working in different fields with different people, so it almost feels like in that rush, in that fastness, that quickness of change, there isn't really a space to step back and reflect on your improvement, and your growth. And the appraisals and ARCPs and things like that, they're just a hurdle, they're just a tick box thing to sign off. frequently, and this is no slight on my seniors, this is because they were massively busy, but often it's just ticking off something and it's just a formality, and that's the feedback that you get. Feedback is the formality. It's not a reflective moment, really.
Yeah, and that makes it even more important then that as individuals we do this for ourselves, because if we're not going to get it from anybody else, we really need to do this individually, don't we? But it's how much time we get to do that, that's the challenge. But it's this kind of thing that will help us in the future when we're facing situations where we know our imposter might come out. And there are lots of times where we will feel our imposter emerging, particularly when we're going to be feeling like we're being judged or it's an approval related task.
Yeah, I mean, for me now, being outside of medicine, I feel like my imposter tells me that I don't deserve the success that I do have, because I don't have a formal qualification. So as I said at the beginning, I'm not formally qualified in marketing. I coach doctors. I'm not formally qualified coach. I'm a coach by experience. And even though I work really hard around it, I read widely, I put in the hours, I do everything that I would if this was an official thing. For me, not having that official stamp from someone else that says, yes, you have studied this, yes, you can do this, somehow that invalidates me, and I feel huge shame around that, and even when there is overwhelming evidence to the contrary, even, like I said in my story, the guy from sales coming to me and saying, you've done an amazing job, even the doctors I coach coming to me and saying, your help's been invaluable. Even with all of that, I still have this feeling of, I'm a fraud, and there's the fear of, someone revealing that. And it's interesting to me to think about how can I expect other people to take my skill set seriously when I don't take it seriously myself.
Yeah. And that's where your beliefs about competence are really important to check. So I talked about the Dr. Val Young book, Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, where she talks about these 5 competence types. So I think I sent them to you. There's the one of them is called the expert, which is where, and women often fall into this trap of feeling like they have to have qualification after qualification after qualification to prove their ability or their skill to do something. So I would recommend you go back and read that, and because some of the reframes of the beliefs that we need to make are around, actually sometimes experience is just as good as a qualification. Depends on the occupation, clearly. So there are times where you need that certificate and you need the exam to prove competence, but there are other times where your level of experience and what you've developed and read and practical things that you've done are just as valuable. And so that's where it's important to go back and stop measuring yourself with a warped measuring stick.
Yeah, absolutely. Sally, I could talk to you about this all day, and there is just so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our session today. And is there if people want to get in touch with you, I know that you're doing a lot of work, you're developing some webinars around imposter syndrome to kind of deeper dive into this topic, so if people are interested in that, if people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so if you want to email me on sallybeyer@outlook.com, I'm just starting to do some webinars for doctors around imposter syndrome. So yeah, if there are any clinicians out there who are interested and who have experiences then they would like to chat through, or they want to find out a bit more, then by all means drop me a line on email. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, so it's Sally Beyer MCIPD. You'll find me at LinkedIn there. So yeah.
Brilliant. Sally, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you being here. And yeah, I wish you all the best with those webinars. They sound really exciting.
Thank you. Take care, Anjali. Bye-bye.
Bye. Right, I will just stop screen sharing so I can say goodbye to all of you guys. Right, there we go. Bye, Sally. Thank you so much, guys, for coming tonight. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'm on live again next Monday. I'm talking about disillusionment with Dr. Giles Morrison, which is going to be brilliant. And then the Monday after that, on May 4th, I'm going to be talking to Chris Hafner about leadership. Any feedback or anything, any themes that you'd like me to explore, or anything at all, really, please get in touch with me. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I am at Disillusioned Med, and subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep updated on future video content as well. And if you're interested in my story, then check out my blog at thedisillusionedmedic.com. Thank you so much. Take care, stay safe, and I'll speak to you next Monday. Bye.